We are so glad you joined us today to get centered, but we have a disclaimer. Being centered really is more of an aspiration than a destination. This is a vodcast where we'll be discussing all things mind and body, mental health, physical well-being, parenting, marriage, healthy touch, anger and how to handle it. What is integrative medicine? How do I meditate? What are we learning from COVID in this quarantine experience? Where do we go from here? You have questions on these topics, and we ask those same questions ourselves. So this isn't a vodcast full of answers. It's one full of discussion, because we're going to tell you right now we do not have all the answers, but we do love a rich discussion and hope you do too. We're Leila Scott and John Price, the founders of the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, and this vodcast is hosted by our amazing team, which is comprised of an integrative group of therapists offering individual, couples, family, depth therapy, and offers support groups for men, women, teens, young professionals, and others. Chinese medicine practitioners offering acupuncture, herbal medicine, food therapy, lifestyle advice, and last but not least, our mindfulness meditation and spirituality guide. Be sure to reach out to us to let us know other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or to let us know if you'd like to work with our integrative team. We are here for you and offering virtual care as well as home delivery of wellness self-care packages during this time of physical separation. Give us a shout at 713-526-4444 and be sure to follow us on social at Center for HAS. And now, please enjoy the show.
Welcome back to Get Centered. This is the clinical team at the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. If you're interested in getting to know the folks on this call, you can go to one of our first episodes and get introduced to everybody. But for now, we're going to continue jumping into topics each episode. Today is the topic of memes. It came up when we were contemplating the various topics we were going to get into, and last week's topic was the cost of convenience. And I urge you to go listen to that. And then as we think about this conversation, it is really about the ways in which we begin to take in information from our culture. And to define this really quickly, because memes mean to the children in our lives, they mean a totally different thing to evolutionary theorists. Memes are a corollary to instincts. It's a way in which the way it's theorized is memetics are ways in which we can transmit cultural information like habits or techniques or ideas from one generation to the next or one group to the next. That helps us define who we are, but certainly helps us engage with our environment and other people to know where we stand and where we don't. So we wanted to talk about this and certainly how it links up to what we do clinically. So I want to just lob this out there to you guys and say, when we started kind of chewing on this, what came up for y'all with regard to memes or memetics or any of these ideas?
Well, initially for me, what came up is just understanding this idea. Like I still even have questions. Is a memetic in the way that we're introducing it here, is that more of a zeitgeist? Is that more of a jargon? Is that more of the type of information that seems to travel on the ether that we all kind of get a download on and we're not sure why? Can you be more specific as to
Yeah, good question. I think so. Where I first stumbled upon this term, it was popularized by Richard Dawkins in one of his books in the 90s. And for those of you that don't know his work, he definitely hung his hat in kind of the materialist world and evolutionary thought. And of course, this is a materialist idea, and that what we're doing is trying to take individual data points like ideas or techniques or habits to see how they transmit themselves from generation to generation or person to person. Where it's really popularized is in the religious study and scholarship. And what we're looking at is how these ideas, these beliefs, these core values that really inform who's the evil other, what your core beliefs are, where your morality lies, how is that transmitted from person to person? So is your belief that there is one God and this is how that God operates, or there are many gods and this is your worldview? And the idea that these central thoughts inform the dendritic tree of all kinds of other thoughts that basically create our worldview. And what we then want to look at, I think, is the reason I think this is valid from a clinician's perspective is that we want to look at how people hang on to those beliefs Again, as a clinician, I want to look at that developmentally. Like, as somebody is growing up, what kind of beliefs or habits or thought forms have they internalized that typically disrupt their way of living? And despite their desires to be happier, healthier, whatever, they end up living out these ideas unconsciously. And so from a clinical lens, as a psychologist, I think one of the values of using this mimetic as a metaphor, really, because I'm not staking a claim and saying these are how these things exist, saying that, wow, that is interesting, that these ideas, like instincts and like genetics, there is another form, more psychologically based form, that we pass these things on to each other. And it can be a good thing, right? Because I want to know how to till the earth if I'm in an agricultural community. But if my belief is essentially the beliefs of my forebearers, and it's not really working for me, I'm in a massive conflict, and I have to try to resolve that and take a look at whatever that may be. And I think the idea of the meme can kind of help us at least hold these ideas and understand that they are transmitted from one to the next, and that we don't have to be so personally identified with that belief system or that belief itself.
In a more basic way, aren't we just talking about the fact that we're pattern seeking? Just the way our brains work is to see things in patterns, like with optical illusions often work because we see patterns that are either subjective or aren't there at all. And so, as it works in analysis, is people adopt these patterns. Some of them are helpful and some of them are not. Some of them are destructive or keep people stuck. But the fact is, everyone needs to see patterns in as a way of organizing our experience. Is that sort of also what we're talking about?
I think it could be. I mean, I think it's probably a little more specific than saying pattern recognition, because essentially when we say pattern recognition, we look at the process. There's this process that happens, but what we're kind of looking at is the content. What fills this, and how do those, what fills the riverbed, so to speak? And then how does what fills the riverbed affect my choices and my understanding of the world? Because even right now, when we're talking and thinking a lot about race, how do these unconscious biases or predispositions about who is what and why they are that way, and how am I kind of led by that as opposed to being more of a free thinker?
I'll raise my hand. No, I think everything that we've kind of been saying, and John, that you've been saying, kind of reminds me of like how water soaks up into a sponge. We can either defend it or take it in for our own. And it's kind of cool to think, like, because I have a lot of cases like this in terms of where my kids are kind of bringing in or soaking in all of these different types of like information, whether it be good, bad, weird, confusing, conflicting. And it's kind of cool because I've had similar case in the past where it's like there's this kid who doesn't feel aligned with mom and dad's values, but mom and dad think that, hey, you need to have these values because mom and dad have these values, but they are conflicting with her own values. So then it's just kind of like, why do we never have this conversation of, okay, why can't I take it in as for myself, but still have mom and dad's values also? Why are we always fighting against those uncomfortable feelings because mom and dad feel a certain way about them? Similar to society, it's like how we learn and process and kind of soak in all this information, whether it's good, bad, or everything in between. How are we deciphering or picking through what we believe in, or more so, how are we soaking in all the information as opposed to only specific information? That's kind of my 2 cents about that.
This reminds me of the conversation I think it's a YouTube going around, a little girl named Haley, who I think argued with her parents over Black Lives Matter. And my question is, so I watched last night someone on Instagram saying, go Haley, but this was the wrong argument to be having. Because yes, of course, Black lives matter and their lives should matter just as much as a white life. But the conversation should have been, oh my God, why are we even having this conversation? Obviously they matter. So my question is, in terms of the meme we're trying to understand, is, are those both memes and one of them is more useful than the other one? Or is that not at all?
I don't think it's more useful than the other. I think it's kind of what you said in the last statement, that it shouldn't be a forethought even to have
Well,
to
that's what, yeah,
consider.
that's what I mean, is that is,
But
so,
maybe that's how we like grew up, you know, cross culturally and developmentally. It's like, hey, there's a good, bad, black, white, and then, you know, super specific. But then when we kind of really get into it, like, you know, of course, every person's life matters. So why should there be that separation? But, you know, culturally, how it's been passed down, even with memes, it's like one person after the other is imitating what we feel is comfortable. So then it's kind of like, well, crap, then how do we become a functioning society altogether? So
and to be clear, it was a Black woman speaking of this conversation saying, you know, look at your own whiteness as opposed to Black Lives Matter. Look at what's up with whites, that we're not looking at our own, in my understanding, what we're talking about, our own memes.
right.
I just keep thinking too how, especially, and Gia, I'm glad you brought up this idea of a sponge, right? Because we talk from that developmental standpoint about how kids are sponges, right? They learn from their environment, from their parents, from school, from just all these like societal contexts. But I think we forget that adults are sponges too, right? I mean, just whether it is memes or just in general, like political propaganda, how easily we can be swayed and manipulated based off of things we think are factual, based off of, again, maybe this group polarization of, well, everybody else is doing it and thinking it, so now I have to do the same thing or else I'm straying away from the path. And I think as adults, it's so important to keep kind of checking ourselves and thinking about, like, what is this value? Do I believe this? Uncovering our truths and recognizing, you know, what is this idea? What is this behavior? Where is it truly coming from? Am I being influenced by others, knowing that it's not aligning with my values? Is it giving me that platform to speak up and change? Is it, again, as we've talked about, having these types of conversations is just simply now having more awareness and beginning that shift, but not being so, I think, sometimes set in our ways because we think it's the right thing.
Yeah, this to me goes into something I think really core, which is belief. And for all you meme scholars out there, I'm sure there are many watching this right now. But just know that this is, you know, we're using this as a jumping off platform to talk about how we ascend. At least the way I'm framing this, is how we end up coming to know and believe what it is we believe. And that essentially, when I've been poking around with folks who really do research this topic a lot, that the nature of belief, the term belief now is meaning some propositional bias, meaning it's a yes/no issue. Like, do you believe it? Yes, I do, or no, I don't. When early on, the etymology of the term, it really is more connected with what do you follow. And so there's this, I mean, it's a totally different meaning system, you know, like, what are you driven towards? What do you go after? What do you follow? Well, I follow, you know, this value system. Not, are you a believer, or do you think that's good or bad? It's what's your value, and what do you live out in your daily life? And if we can use some of these ideas like memes, for example, and even begin to consider, oh yeah, there are possibly, and I know that there are these forms that I've taken in that aren't based in my own experience, that have helped with, as we said last time, convenience, or the economy of mind. I just need to learn quickly. And so whether it's how to plow the field, or how to communicate, or what my religious beliefs are, just the idea that I can take that in then sets up to actually have a conversation with, is that really something you believe? Is it something you want to continue believing? Meaning, in the truest sense of the term, is it the life you really want to live?
for me, this is a conversation that comes down back to like, I'm teaching mindfulness, meditation, trying to kind of like surface some of the subconscious in some way so that we can make it conscious and then not fall prey to the things that are sort of running us in the background automatically. And I love what Gia said, because you're sort of like right at the base level of, you're watching what we in our context, or in in the therapy context or in the meditation context, are trying to unwind for ourselves. Like, I'm not even talking about what I do with clients. I'm talking about what I'm trying to do with myself. It's like, I know that for my own self, when I this concept of memes comes in, it's like, oh my God, how in what, it makes me just start to ask the question of like, what beliefs do I have that are not my own, and then that I got from my parents, let's say, right? And then, but then it doesn't stop there. It's like, if this concept of memes is true, then it's further than my parents, right? And then I have to ask, like, okay, I can't just blame my parents for the meme they handed me, because they got their meme from someone else before them, right? And so then it's like, okay, well, now we're all in the same pot here. So instead of trying to blame this person for giving me this meme and that thing and then whatever, it's kind of like, okay, listen, we're all societally stuck in this one same place altogether, right? That I'm personally stuck in my own life. I'm trying to wake up from it. And so, like, it gives me that kind of, it's like I sort of use my own experience. I try to see how much of it maps out over many people's experience. And then I have a place for compassion for myself, understanding that this is bigger than me, right? And also for other people who I see getting trapped in it, who are not yet there, right? In terms of having awoken to the forces that are underneath, kind of telling them what to do. And this, I don't want to take it in a different direction, but it really has a lot to do with myth, right? What myths are we believing? What myth do we take for granted, right? Like, what stories do we tell as a civilization, as a culture, as a religion, as a household, as a community, right? Those, and sort of start to like ask the questions of what are the stories that we're telling, right? And that's a process. But it comes back to compassion. It helps with the compassion in the end, for myself and for everybody around me.
Yeah, I mean, I think not getting locked in a good or bad thing, because culture and tradition have a lot of value, and that connects us with other people who've come before us, if we continue that tradition. So there's certainly, it's not an either or, but yeah, then you get to have choice. And I'm with you. I know how important, Ariel, that you light up when the term compassion is said. I know that's a central value, so to have compassion for ourselves as we work internally, on our self-work, to try to say, like, how am I living out things that aren't necessarily me?
Right. Yeah. And when we have that, then we can be, when I know that I can do it for myself, right? When I can be, or somebody has done it for me. Usually it doesn't even come from inside. Usually it happens in the context of a good friend or a mentor or somebody who can see from the outside. They can show me, hey, listen, this is not just you, right? This is societal. This is not just your parents told you that story, right? This is bigger than that. This is an age-old tale, right? Then it's like, oh, okay, so I can stop blaming my parents for that, right? And I can also have compassion for them for the fact that they get sucked into the same thing, right? And now all of a sudden it just shifts the conversation.
Yeah, and I think having the ability to evolve when it's necessary to evolve without losing the importance of the history and the culture is this piece around unraveling the identity that we have for ourselves from our beliefs. Because if my beliefs are who I am, then for me to evolve what I believe into something, whether that's more inclusive or whatever word you want to use, that's going to be a bigger threat to who I am, unless I can see the two as separate things.
That's a great point. I don't know. This is just an idea I want to toss out for all of y'all to chew on. This thought of like, we cling to what is familiar. Right. And I'm wondering where you guys see that in your various practices and how you work with that, because from a psychological lens, we talk about defense mechanisms. And so whenever, and this is technical stuff, right? So that whenever the ego is at risk of being challenged, it defends itself in all these ways of repression and suppression, denial and projection, and so on and so forth. That so this ego that's had to form a cohesive identity and sense of self to operate in a chaotic world, it on some level is terrified of being overthrown or being critiqued or being told it's wrong, because its core essence is based on survival. It's trying to survive. And so psychologically, when we work with this from a therapeutic perspective, when you start to bump into some of these ideas that people hold as central, it creates enormous defense. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's an indicator. I mean, Rodney, you could probably associate on this on the word association test, but we push up against it, or we're not aware of it. It doesn't bother us. Like, we don't even think about it. But there is something about clinging to familiar, and I wonder if y'all could just toss that around a bit.
Well, Ariel sort of alluded to the idea of what we're not conscious of. And so, what you were saying, John, made me think of, working, as a therapist, clinician, whatever. The way I see it isn't so much that I'm bumping up against that, is that they're bumping up against it within their own psyche. There's something within them that doesn't necessarily agree with the way that things have been laid out, or whatever, they have, using the sponge analogy, whatever they've absorbed. Then at a certain point as an adult, it's like, okay, this isn't necessarily something that works. So the idea of listening within oneself to see what is on automatic pilot, what is just an assumption I've always had that this is the way it works. But the invitation is to listen inward, because those conflicts are coming from within the person, and so the answers also come from within the person.
Well, one thing I'd like to point out too is because sometimes what's familiar isn't always most productive or most effective. I mean, even if we think of traditions, do we repeat them just out of the sake of repetition, or does it really have value and meaning? I mean, even as we're talking about evolution, right? It's a natural biological force. If there's something that's ineffective on our bodies that we don't need, that we don't work, it will naturally go away, right? I mean, I would imagine we had tails right now if we needed them. But I think as humans, we have to keep ourselves in check with that too, of recognizing, what am I doing just solely because it feels right, versus is it really the best for me? And that's where, I don't know, I get concerned when people do cling on to these traditions, because they call them traditions, when in reality it's rooted in something that's full of hatred or judgment, or something that's doing them a disservice. I recently just had a conversation with a client who was talking about how she constantly engages in this kind of like hostile, aggressive behavior out because of her pride, and she recognizes that. And now we're kind of working towards, okay, well, what is pride informing you? What is it doing for you? Maybe in the past it was a survival instinct, but now it's hurting you more. And we've talked so much about that, at least through COVID, of what am I doing too much of versus what am I doing too little of? Maybe it's the same with these values and traditions we have, is what am I doing too mindlessly versus what can I start to be more conscientious and mindful of?
I want to press rewind, Nat.
Yeah, well, that's what we're talking about, right? You can start having those conversations, like, and then that's where the work kind of, it's like that's the beginning step of the work, right? Once we surface something that's been playing in the background, right? I'm thinking about one of my clients who, has been having the same fight with her spouse for decades, right? We all know what that is, like what that's like. It's like you have the same fight over and over. It's like you just press repeat, rewind, repeat, and it's just on a loop. And it's just like she was about to get in there, and then she recognized, like, oh my God, the story I'm telling myself is right now, and this is like a meme, right, that she has from inside. And I don't think it's just hers, because I have it too, and I've met a lot of people who have the same story. And the story is, there's not enough love for me here, right? All of a sudden, she was in touch with that, and it was like, because of the fact that we had surfaced it, now it was not like gonna play. Now it was not gonna run the show anymore, and it was, and she was able to work with that instead of launching into the fight, right? And that's like, it's not to say that that's easy, right? But instead of having the fight that you've had 30, 1,000 times over the last 20 years, now you can actually turn towards the real source of the struggle, which is, I think that there's not enough love in the world for,
Mm.
and then when I feel that way, I want to fight with my husband, right? And so it sort of changes the dynamic of, it's like we could put an interrupter on. Once we surface the memes, we can put an interrupter on the kind of automatic flow of our lives.
The thought, you're bringing up something interesting, and I had this kind of dual image, which was there are experiences that are based in our subjectivity, but I've concluded something based upon my understanding of the world, and that'll oftentimes happen developmentally. Because if somebody didn't show up for me in a particular way, or if they overwhelm me in a particular way, and if that was chronic, certainly, there were conclusions that I have about my environment that I carry with me that I will end up enacting consciously or unconsciously later on in my life. So there's one thing. And then the second thing is this: I have a predisposition like language. I'm tuned in to learn my language. Also, I take, or I'm given from the environment these habits, tools, ways of being, that aren't so. It's weird. I think, I can't remember if I said it earlier on this episode or before we were recording, but it's like electricity. I've never been harshly electrocuted. I mean, I've been zapped a couple of times, but I'm sure there was a period of time in my life where I didn't need to be told, don't touch that. Or I just knew, right? I mean, like, I knew not to touch those things. I never had to have the experience. And so then what about, what traditions we have, like, again, I think these really primed subjects around race, around gender, around sexuality, around culture, around how we engage with other cultures, around how we behave when we interact with other, those things tend to be based either in kind of, Ariel, what you're saying, in a subjective space, or we could just have no understanding, have no interaction with other cultures, for example, and have beliefs about those other cultures because they were passed on to us, which I think opens up a whole entire network of discussion beyond what we're doing here, but it's an interesting curiosity. Ariel, if you've got something lined
No,
up.
I mean, the water runs real deep here, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's like, right, I might be able to help surface in my own self some of the stuff up top that's like top of mind, that's coming up over and over, but to get down to the roots of that, right, that, what you're talking about is a kind of, that's going to be a collective, right? Because I can't know what yours and Lila Scott's and Rodney and Gia's and Nat's like upbringings are, right? And there's hundreds more, thousands, millions more of those kinds of memes along the path that have been planted from many years ago, right? That we have to kind of work on surfacing as a whole in some way. I mean, I'm hopeful that can be, right? I'm hopeful.
Of course, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. With kind of the practical in mind, it's weird for me to go into a practical space, but I am curious about when you think about, like, what is your feedback to people? What is your advice? How do you hold space for people when they're in this position of considering how, I don't know where this thing came from, whether it's developmental or subjective, or it was just passed down to me. But when you notice that people are kind of clinging, whether it's an eating habit or an idea or a belief, how do you help people begin to consider that that's not necessarily you?
We've mentioned this before on the podcast, but just how the mind, being a sponge, has taken in anything from the TV show you watched last night to the conversation that was had at a dinner table when, we're hearing things that we don't even realize we're hearing. Excuse me. And then suddenly...
We're hearing things.
Right? And then suddenly we believe it. I'm not attractive. I'm not smart. the world is now flat.
It's a buildup of those subtle messages that ultimately become that larger interpretation.
Yeah. So kind of introducing the idea to people that the mind is not necessarily the place to go for one's own advice.
In Jungian analysis, one cool thing is always working with dreams, because the dreams are going to challenge the ego. That's one reason they're there. I mean, generally, if we think we know what a dream means, then we're deluding ourselves, because it wouldn't be there if it weren't trying to help us understand a different angle or a different perspective. And so that can be really helpful in the therapy, because that's coming from the person themselves again. But also it's a challenge to these conscious beliefs that are held onto in a kind of autopilot fashion.
It's so interesting, Rodney. You're reminding me that the other night I dreamt about like a triangle becoming a cone, a circle becoming a sphere, a square becoming a cube. It was like my dream just kept repeating, going from 2D to 3D.
Uh-huh.
Ooh, we'll have to talk about it.
Anything else, guys, before we close it out?
For me, it always comes back to that compassion space. It's like, I just understand from my own work how tender I need to be with myself and how tender other people have been with me in doing the work. And so I think that that's the thread that I try to hang on to as much as possible when I'm working with somebody who's coming up against one of these kinds of things, because it can be really hard, right? Especially, and I don't want to trigger the whole ego, like, defense mechanism thing, right? Because then we're back to square one, right? The ego is really strong. It just throws up the defense, and then you're locked out. And so I really try to do it really compassionately and slowly, and do it more like a soak than like an abrasive, right? It's like, let's let time do the work. Let's let time be on our side, and let's not think of this as a race to get it done, right? Because even though there is some urgency and it can happen quickly, it's like, let's not force it to, right? Let's not try to force anything. It's just easy, slow. And sometimes that easy, slow makes things go fast, right? It's like, sometimes not, but either way, it's like, let's put time on our side, Let's think of this as an unfolding instead of I've got to get it done right now kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, the one thought that I've got is that it's so important to create trust. And in a therapeutic dynamic and a clinical dynamic with a practitioner that you're working with, I think, the spoiler alert here is that most of the research on what brings about change for somebody is the relationship. That it's how we all know about placebo and nocebo and all those things. Again, these beliefs hold a lot of value, and they manifest physiologically. I can have a belief that I'm getting a pill and I don't get a pill, and yet the pill works. I can have a belief that I'm not getting the pill, but I get the pill and it doesn't work. And like that, all of a sudden, what's happening with that? And so our belief patterns really do influence the material world. And so there's not these really fine lines between them. So when it comes to clinically, I think it's imperative, and any clinician would tell you this, that having trust and being able to move into those spaces to consider that the ways in which we've created our beliefs aren't necessarily genuinely ourselves. And then, of course, starts the heavy lifting of, who am I? Well, thanks, you guys. Thanks for being here, and thanks for watching. We'll be back next week. See you then.
Yeah.